Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into something really big, actually, for folks who are permanent residents in the U.S. and working towards citizenship.
Okay. Yeah.
We're talking about a new policy straight from USCIS, and it's all about simplifying the whole path to becoming a citizen. You know how re-entering the U.S. after traveling can be a real pain sometimes? Like you're jumping through hoops and
Oh, yeah.
it's all confusing. Well, this policy aims to clear up a lot of that confusion, hopefully, and just make the process a lot fairer for everyone.
Right. And what's fascinating about this new policy is it all kind of goes back to this pretty significant legal case, Assuming v. Garland.
Oh, yeah. I remember hearing about that.
Yeah. Basically, the court decided that USCIS was being a little unreasonable, I guess you could say, by potentially denying people citizenship just because they had a few hiccups with their re-entry paperwork.
Oh, wow.
Even if their initial entry was totally legal and by the book.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying someone could have lived here for years, done everything right, but then, like, a minor paperwork issue at customs could completely mess up their chances of becoming a citizen?
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't seem right.
It was a big problem for a lot of people, especially those who may first enter the U.S. through humanitarian parole.
Right.
Like fleeing a dangerous situation back home. And then later, they adjust their status to permanent resident.
But they're doing things the right way.
Yeah, exactly. But then years later, they're facing this roadblock to citizenship just because of a technicality at the border.
Wow. So they're coming here seeking safety and then basically getting punished for it later on.
Yeah, it was a real issue.
That's really rough. So how does this new policy change things for those folks?
Well, under the old policy, someone in that situation could have been denied citizenship if they weren't formally readmitted as a permanent resident every single time they returned to the U.S.
Every time. Oh, wow.
Yeah, but this new policy focuses on that very first lawful entry as a permanent resident.
So the initial entry is what matters.
Exactly. As long as you initially came in legally, any later reentry issues, even something like entering on parole again, those aren't a deal breaker anymore for citizenship.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So they're basically saying, look, if you came here legally from the start, we're not going to hold these minor reentry things against you. It seems like a pretty big shift, not just in like the rules themselves, but also in how USCIS views permanent residents and their whole journey to citizenship.
Yeah, I think you're right. It suggests a shift in focus from scrutinizing every single little detail of someone's reentry history to looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
You know, their initial legal entry and their continuous commitment to making the U.S. their home.
Yeah, like, we trust you, we appreciate your contributions, and we want to make this process work for you.
Exactly.
That's a big deal. So this Assuma v. Garland case really pushed USCIS to rethink their approach, huh?
It really did. The court basically said, hey, you can't keep penalizing people for these reentry issues that were often totally out of their control, especially if they were already a lawful permanent resident to begin with.
They had the right to be here.
Exactly. This forced USCIS to take a hard look at their policies, and they ended up adopting a much fairer and more logical approach.
It's pretty wild how one court case can have such a big impact and lead to this big policy change. It really shows the power of legal challenges to actually change the system.
Yeah, it really does. And it shows that sometimes the courts have to step in and say, hey, this isn't right, this isn't fair. And in this case, it led to a policy that's a win for fairness and efficiency.
Definitely. So I think I'm getting the overall picture, but for those of us who aren't immigration law experts, could you break down what this means, practically speaking? What are the key takeaways people should know?
Sure. The most important thing to remember is this. If you were lawfully admitted as a permanent resident, either when you first entered the U.S. or after adjusting your status, you're still eligible for citizenship, period. That's the core of the new policy. It's all about acknowledging that being a lawful permanent resident is the foundation for the path to citizenship.
Okay, that's good to hear. But what about those who came in under parole or other temporary statuses? How does this new policy affect them?
Well, that's where the good news really comes. In reentries under parole or those other temporary statuses aren't considered deal breakers anymore. The focus now is completely on that first lawful entry as a permanent resident.
So it's about clearing up all that confusion and getting rid of unnecessary roadblocks for folks who are already here legally and making their lives here.
Precisely. It's about making the system more accessible and easier to understand for those who are following the rules and trying to achieve the American dream.
It seems like this new policy isn't just making it easier to become a citizen, it's also sending a message of inclusion and support to lawful permanent residents. It's recognizing their commitment to this country and saying, we want you here.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's about recognizing that these folks are already a part of American society and that their contributions are valuable. This policy just removes a big hurdle that was standing in their way.
Now, I'm sure there's some people thinking, okay, this sounds great, but what about people abusing this new policy? You mentioned earlier there were some concerns about that. Could you explain that a little more?
Sure. One concern is whether this change might create a loophole for people who maybe entered the U.S. illegally to try and claim they actually had lawful permanent resident status all along.
Right, that makes sense. So how does USCIS plan to address that and make sure no one's taking advantage of the system?
Well, USCIS already has really strong systems in place for verifying people's immigration history and spotting any fraudulent claims.
So they're not just taking people at their word, they're making sure everything checks out.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between making things easier for legitimate applicants, but also keeping the system secure. They're not just opening the floodgates. They're just removing an unfair barrier for those who deserve a fair shot.
This has been really helpful. I feel like we've really gotten into the details of this new policy and what it means for people. But I'm curious about the bigger picture here. Do you think this could be a model for simplifying other parts of the immigration system too?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's something policymakers should definitely be considering. If this policy works well in streamlining the path to citizenship without compromising security, it could absolutely be a blueprint for tackling other areas where the process is way too complex or difficult.
It would be amazing to see this common sense approach being used more broadly in immigration policy. It seems like a win for everyone involved, applicants, USCIS, and the country as a whole.
It's all about finding that sweet spot where we can have a system that's secure and efficient, but also fair and compassionate to those who are just trying to build a life here legally.
And speaking of building a life here, I'd love to hear more about how this new policy is directly impacting people on the ground.
Let's dive into that right after a quick break.
Sounds good. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about how this policy could really help people. And we even mentioned Maria, whose path to citizenship hit a snag because of how her initial entry on humanitarian parole was being handled. Now that this new policy is in effect, what does this mean for her situation specifically?
Honestly, it's a total game changer for her.
Yeah.
Remember, Maria had to flee a dangerous situation, came here on humanitarian parole, and later adjusted to permanent resident status. She's really built a life here, contributed to her community, but that initial parole entry was always like a question mark hanging over her.
Right, because under the old rules, it felt like they were using that against her, even though she was here legally as a permanent resident.
Exactly. It created this unfair and kind of illogical barrier for her. But now with this policy change, that barrier is completely gone. Her initial lawful entry as a permanent resident is all that matters now. She's free to apply for citizenship without that worry about her parole status coming back to bite her.
Yeah.
It's a huge relief for her.
That's got to feel amazing. It's incredible to think about how many people are in similar situations and how this policy could help them.
It really is. This policy is not just about changing a rule, it's about changing lives. It's about allowing people like Maria to finally reach their full potential and embrace their American identity.
That's really powerful. So we've talked a lot about the good things about this policy change, but are there any potential downsides or challenges we should be aware of?
It's a good question to ask. One challenge might be making sure that everyone at USCIS is applying this policy the same way across all their offices. We don't want one office interpreting it one way, another office doing something different. Consistency is key to making sure the process is fair for everyone.
So everyone needs to be on the same page and apply the rules consistently. Make sense? Are there any other concerns?
Well, another concern, and we talked about this a bit earlier, is the possibility of fraud. Could this policy create a loophole for people who entered the U.S. illegally to try and take advantage of it? It's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. So how would someone even try to do that? And what's in place to prevent it?
Well, someone might try to say they've had lawful permanent resident status this whole time, even if they haven't. But USCIS has a very thorough process for checking an applicant's immigration history. They don't just take your word for it. They look at records, cross-reference information, and have systems for catching inconsistencies that could point to fraud.
So it's not like this policy suddenly opens the door for anyone to make whatever claim they want. There are still checks and balances to protect the system.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that right balance. We want to make the system more accessible for people who are eligible, while also making sure it can't be abused.
I'm also thinking about the huge backlog of cases that USCIS is already dealing with. Won't this new policy just add to that backlog and potentially slow down the process for everyone?
I see your point.
Yeah.
However, USCIS has said that they're committed to implementing this policy efficiently and are taking steps to make sure it doesn't make the current processing times even longer. They're actually arguing that this change could help streamline things in the long run by removing the need to investigate all those reentry issues that aren't relevant anymore.
So maybe a bit of a slowdown at first, but hopefully smoother sailing for everyone once things settle in.
That's the hope. And it'll be interesting to see how it all works out in practice.
It sounds like there's a lot of optimism about this policy change, but also a healthy dose of caution and awareness of the challenges. It's about moving forward with hope, but also being realistic about the complexities.
I think you put it perfectly. It's always about finding that balance between idealism and pragmatism. That's the key to good policymaking.
Definitely. So we've explored the legal background, the human impact, and the potential challenges. Now, for our listeners who are wondering how this applies to their own lives, let's get practical.
All right, let's do it. What are the actual steps someone needs to take if they think this policy change might apply to them? What should they do?
That's a great question. Let's get into those nitty-gritty details right now. Okay, so we're back and ready to talk about what this new policy means for you listening right now. If you're thinking, wait a minute, could this actually apply to me? What are the first steps you should take?
Well, first of all, don't freak out. Knowledge is power. So the first thing you got to do is head over to the USCIS website.
Okay.
They have all the details there, all the guidelines and eligibility requirements.
Right, so get informed, bookmark those pages, and start going through that checklist.
Exactly. And here's something super important. You don't have to do this alone. If you have any questions or if your situation's a little complicated, talking to an experienced immigration attorney is a really good idea.
Really important.
Absolutely.
They can help you figure out if this policy change actually benefits you and walk you through the whole application process.
Yep. It's like having a personalized roadmap just for you.
Right. Makes sense.
Think of it like this. You wouldn't try to fix your car's engine yourself, right? Especially if it's a big problem. You go to a mechanic.
Yeah, right.
Immigration law can be really complicated, and an attorney is like your expert mechanic. They can help you avoid making mistakes that could cost you time and money.
That's a great analogy. So USCIS website for the official info and an attorney for that personalized advice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now let's go back to Maria for a second. Remember her situation. Imagine her going through these steps. She gathers all her documents, talks to an attorney, and because of this policy, her path to citizenship is finally clear. That worry about her humanitarian parole entry is gone.
It's amazing how one policy change can have such a big impact on someone's life.
Yeah, it is. And it's not just about individual stories like Maria's. It's about what this means for immigration policy as a whole. Could this be an example for how we deal with other parts of the system?
That's the big question, right? If making things simpler works here, could it work in other areas too? It really makes you wonder if we're making things more complicated than they need to be.
It's a conversation we need to have. If we can streamline things, make them easier to understand, and still keep the system secure and fair, why wouldn't we do that?
It feels like this new policy is opening up a bigger conversation about how we can make the whole immigration system more humane, more efficient, and in the end, more just.
And that's something to be excited about.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even complicated systems can change, adapt, and become more responsive to the needs of people.
This deep dive has been really informative, and the main takeaway is clear. If you're a permanent resident, this new USCIS policy could make a huge difference in your life.
Yeah, don't miss out on this opportunity.
Get informed, find an expert to help you, and take that next step towards achieving your citizenship goals.
And remember, knowledge is power.
And that wraps up our deep dive for today. We hope you feel more informed and empowered to navigate this new policy.
We hope so.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep working towards a better future.
That's it for us. Thanks for listening.
Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel US Immigration News. We hope you are doing great. In this video, we are going to talk about the new USCIS policy streamlines path to US citizenship. USCIS has introduced a new policy that simplifies the naturalization process for lawful permanent residents, particularly those who have faced challenges when returning to the United States after traveling abroad. Previously, complications during re-entry such as being granted parole instead of being formally readmitted as a permanent resident could disqualify users from applying for US citizenship. This often led to confusion and the denial of application for long-term residents who had been otherwise eligible. The new guidance clarifies that what matters most for citizenship eligibility is an individual's initial lawful admission as a permanent resident, whether they occurred during their first entry into the US or through a subsequent adjustment of status. Re-entries under parole or other temporary status will no longer block LPRs from pursuing naturalization, making the process more accessible to those who have experienced past travel-related complications. This policy change addresses a critical issue for many LPRs who left the US for extended periods due to work, family emergencies, or personal reasons. In some cases, customs and border protection officers questioned whether these individuals had abandoned this residency and a result did not formally readmit them as a permanent residents. Instead, they were granted temporary status like parole, which could later disqualify them from applying for naturalization under the old rules. The new policy is a direct response to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decision is an Azuma versus Carlect case, which ruled that applicants should not be penalized for re-entry complication if their initial entry or adjustment of status was lawful. USCIS has now aligned its policies with this court decision, ensuring that individuals who face difficulties during re-entry are treated more fairly during the citizenship process. This update has significant implications for lawful permanent residents, especially those who have encountered re-entry complications after traveling abroad. It also benefits humanitarian parolees who entered the US under temporary or emergency circumstances and later adjusted their status to permanent residence. These individuals will now be able to apply for US citizenship without their initial parole status negatively affecting their eligibility. Overall, the policy marks a major improvement in the naturalization process by removing unnecessary obstacles and making it easier for LPRs to move forward on their path to citizenship. It ensures that an individual's initial lawful admission, rather than temporary re-entry issues, is the determining factors in their eligibility for naturalization.